Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast, Mr. Montague. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, sure. My name is Montague, and David Montague. I am a former senior investigator for the United States Assassination Records Review Board, and I served at the review board from 1995 until 1997, when I left to go and do my PhD at Howard University. Nowadays, I'm Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs over student success at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and I'm also a tenured full professor of criminal justice. And so that's a little bit about me. I'm married and have a college student, one child who's a college student, and I'm very pleased to be with you today.
Can you tell me how you got started in the Assassination Records Review Board?
Sure. So in the early 1990s, I'm originally from the Washington, D.C. area. And after I used to work for the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. And while I was at the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, I specialized in white collar, so I call it diversion investigations. I did a lot of interviews of pharmacists and physicians, nurses. Interviewing was a really big part, and looking through records, was a really big part of the job. A lot of things we did were kind of civil cases that often would turn criminal, and not all the time. But we had to have expertise in our investigation to be able to do audits of facilities, be able to know how to talk to people and engage with people. And I think that's kind of background as to how I was approached. So one day I was in New Jersey. I was assigned to Newark, New Jersey. I graduated Quantico in 1991. And I was in Newark, New Jersey, and I got a phone call. And on the phone was David Marwell. And David Marwell was the executive director of the Assassination Records Review Board. And, he said he got my resume. And so, I, and I had been looking to possibly relocate back to the Washington, D.C. area. And he said he had a pool of resumes, and the fact that I had done a lot of interviews and was used to going in different facilities, it kind of caught his eye and wanted to know if I'd be willing to come to Washington, D.C. and have a conversation with him about a potential investigative position. And so this is 1994. And so I did. And I got on a train, took the Amtrak down to Washington, D.C., and we had a meeting in the offices. They were on 6th, as in the number 6 Street, right around the corner from the National Law Enforcement Memorial. And so I went to the building, and I really didn't understand what it was about. DEA held a top secret security clearance already. I've been doing, the work for a couple of years, and with them. I graduated Quantico in 91, I mentioned. So when I was talking to David Marwell, it was really not that many people in the office. And he explained that they were part of a federal investigative effort to look at assassination. And I was thinking to myself, oh, so it's an assassination review board. I'm guessing they look at documents related to assassination, do intelligence gathering, that kind of. And then as he was talking, and I started looking around the office, I saw more and more material related to President John F. Kennedy, and I was like, well, that's kind of interesting. And then the light bulb went off on my head, and I said, so this agency is really about the assassination of one president, President John F. Kennedy. And I have to admit I was a little naive in finally asking that question. He said, "Oh yeah, yeah. There's so much. We tangentially we're also looking at Martin Luther King's assassination, and we're also looking at the president's brother Bobby Kennedy. But there were so many unusual things that were going on during that time period. And he might have used the word tumultuous time period. I don't know anymore, but." And I know I didn't say it to him, but in the back of my mind, when he got up to check something and he left the room for a second, I looked around, I saw all these books. I saw the Posner book and I saw some other books, on his desk. And I was sitting there like, surely this is not a federal agency created to look at just this. And little did I know how deep the rabbit hole went, you know. And so I guess the joke was on me because when he came in and started talking about some of the complexity, the gave me a kind of brief history. I was unaware of the multiple federal investigative examinations of the assassination of President Kennedy. Being from the Washington D.C. area, I wasn't alive when the president was killed. I was born in '66, but I found out from my family that they took me down to the Capitol Rotunda area, and my family went down there and they stood in line. I remember my mother telling me for over 10 hours, waiting to see. I believe it was the carriage, that had the casket on there in the Capitol Rotunda, and so you know to me, that was something that I was told as a child. And then when I came home and talked about my experience that evening, before I went back up to New Jersey, I went and visit my family, in DC. And they were like, "Are you kidding? This is about President Kennedy, who did so much to help a lot of people, was very progressive, and was, you know, one of the first people to openly talk about, civil rights and trying to do economic change to really open doors and create better access for people and just a whole lot of things, and um I said, yeah. And I said, and unfortunately I don't know more than that right now. So I went back to New Jersey, um and I got called back down for another uh interview, and so I went back down, um and this time I actually met with Ann Buttimer, who was at that time head of investigations. And so she had, was FBI background, and she was an attorney and stuff like that. And so we talked, and I was used to panel interviews. I'd done them. Panel is a multi-person interview. For those that don't know. Um, and I was familiar with that. That's especially common in law enforcement. Type settings, to get different perspectives and people watching and stuff like that. But we sat and talked just for a long time. It was really interesting because it was a conversation more than a interview, kind of feeling to it.
You getting
And
some deja vu a little bit?
yeah. Well, I mean, I've done so many talks about it. I mean, everybody's different. I like your interview style. In the sense it's I feel very relaxed, casual right now, which is good. And at this point, I've done so many of them, I don't really get, you know, flustered or anything anyway. But yeah, I like this is very nice. But I remember in that meeting, we just kind of talked more and more about she asked more questions about what kind of investigative work had I done. Kind of asked something about my academic background. I have a PhD. I mean, a PhD in political science now, but back then, I had completed my bachelor's in political science, and I had started a master's program in the forensic science department. My bachelor's is from Morehouse College, political science, and I did a lot of international relations, American government, comparative politics, stuff like that. And the master's program I was in the forensic science department, but it was a white collar crime program. So we did. It wasn't typical type of coursework, and I thought she was really interested to know about that. And she wanted to know why I wasn't in Washington D.C. with that program. I said when I graduated Quantico, I I was assigned to Newark, New Jersey, and it's so funny because at the university I am now, I used to be head of the distance learning office, and back then we really didn't have robust distance learning, and so I exhausted what I could between New Jersey and DC, but eventually had to transfer schools to Rutgers University, so I went. Rutgers was kind of like traditional criminal justice master's program. You're learning about theory and corrections and policing, things like that. But at George Washington University, it was a really different kind of take on white collar crime. Most of the people in the program uh, already came with investigative experience. So it was really a program geared toward professionals in the field. So a lot of my colleagues that were students, this is before I moved to New Jersey, um, a lot of them were, investigators for like NASA or Army, CID or CIC. They changed names a few times back then. Air Force OSI or Energy or different, or state and local cops, and so the point is they all had field experience that way, and so the coursework uh, you know, was different as well. So, for instance, a lot of my courses were, some of them were conspiracy, fraud in government contracting, terrorism, and they would bring in these a lot of adjuncts to teach these classes. And the guy who taught fraud and government contracting was a supervisor with the Secret Service. The person who taught conspiracy, I remember his name, Ben Larigo. He was at that time head of the criminal division for the Internal Revenue Service. And then I forgot who taught us terrorism. But you get the point that they're very focused types of courses that are really very applied, very, very applied. And so I think that appealed to Ann Buttimer when I was being interviewed. We talked a long time. I don't remember how long it was, but I remember when because I came back down to DC, and and people had left the office. It was that long we were talking. It was really in depth. And based on that, I was told that I probably would be contacted about doing another interview based on what happened after, that day. So I waited about another month or so. And mind you, this is all 1994. And I got another call, and it was a kind of a phone discussion, and I can't remember. I don't think it was Tom Samolak, but it might have been David Marwell. There was somebody else on. There was like two people on the phone. Can't remember exactly who now, but it basically was really short. And then the out of that, oh, Jeremy Gunn was on there, and then it was come back to Jeremy Gunn was head of research and analysis at the Assassination Records Board,
Yeah, I've been
and
trying to get him on here.
yeah. Uh, and so then I was invited to come back to DC for another interview. And so what's interesting is uh, by that time I was transitioning to come back to the DC area. I was, just really got tired of New Jersey. I wanted to be back home. I was in a commuting type of relationship, marriage at the time, and that was hard, to do that. And so getting back to DC was a really good option for me. And so I came back for this other interview, and I sat down with Jeremy Gunn, and that was a very interesting uh, scenario based interview. And that was a little different from other types of interviews I had done. And it was a lot of what would you do in this situation? What would you do in that situation? And it turned out a lot of those scenarios involved a lot of the agencies that now we know had records and things like that. So I thought it was kind of really interesting that he approached it that way. and just kind of wanted to see what my mindset was and how I felt about how willing I was to use due diligence to kind of try to figure out things that did weren't right in my face, or potentially understand whether I need to dig a little more. So that interview happened, and then finally, I think I had a call. Um, was it Tammy? I can't remember. It was the head of the human resources part of the agency at that time. There, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I got a call to start working on submitting paperwork if I was interested, and so I said, well, interested in what? And then to put David on the phone, David's like, yeah, we want to offer you a position, and but you're going to have to get top secret, you know, clearance. I said, well, I've got it. He said, well, no, we're gonna have to do it again. Yeah, you know, and you're gonna have to get an SCI attached, and that's sensitive compartment and information category of clearance, which is very special. And so and it said that's something required for everybody. So I said, okay, all right, fine. That sounds good. We talked, some of the logistics, if you will, salary and things like that. And next thing you know, I had done the paperwork, and um, that's kind of how I, was started that process. Now, it took a while to go through. I remember I started, and when I came in, there was, a few people in the CIA team. We had different teams, CIA team, FBI team, forensics team, military team, and so forth. And bottom line is that's kind of how I got there. And a few months later, they finished doing. Actually, about a month, not even a month later, I went and did the getting read in at SCI as well. So that way, that gave me access to additional things that I needed to be able to do, and to travel more to be able to go to certain facilities and do the type of investigative research that I needed to do. But that's kind of how I got uh, there, which I thought was very interesting, very different from some of the previous experience I had.
I gotta ask about when you came home and you kinda told your family about, the interview you did at any point, did they instill anything? Like, did they believe conspiracy? Did they have any thoughts on the whole assassination thing? I mean, if they went to go see his casket and everything, I feel like they'd have to have some thoughts and ideas about. I mean, everyone saw Jack Ruby shoot Oswald, at least some people did on television, so I have to think they would already have some thoughts in their head already about, what happened to Kennedy, who got him, or if they believe the
Right.
official story or not.
So that's a great question. The answer is yes. People did, ask. In fact, people that just were kind of friends of mine. I was very transparent, and one thing that I learned from David Marwell from the very beginning was, unlike other types of intelligence agencies, and I think anyone that's listening should really think of the Assassination Records Review Board as an intelligence, agency, if you will, because it was really dealing with information gathering and putting information, but it's different. It was one with a mandate that was totally different from any of the previous investigations into President Kennedy's assassination. It was one with a mandate of really trying to put as much as possible in the National Archives under deed of gift to be able to make it open to the public. So, uh, understanding that hey, yeah, there were some things we had access to we couldn't talk about unless we knew they were declassified. The fact that we're doing the work was very open and very public and very transparent, and I like that. Made it feel good. So my family did ask me, um, and they told me their thoughts, and they just a lot of folks that in my immediate family. I have a very small immediate family. They're all gone now, but they you know, they didn't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Um, and, people that were just that I knew from my neighborhood, that I just was friends and I see them outside because I would help come home, take the trash out and stuff like that for my family, so they would some of them did believe in single bullet theory, and conspiracy theory. I mean, single bullet theory versus conspiracy theory. But more often than not, most of them were saying conspiracy. But it was interesting that while I was doing the interview process, and even when I remember coming on board and when I was finally getting walked around the office and introduced to everybody, people were very open about their thought on the assassination. I mean, very, very open, and some people were like, "Oh, it case closed. We're here, but we're gonna show the public." I'm like, and when I listen to all of those different viewpoints, and I think what's important for your listeners is to know that David Montague, me, that I did not have a viewpoint going into this. I wasn't alive when the president was killed. I knew a lot and admired what the president had done, just like I've been a student of political science, right? And so I did not have a view either way, right? I didn't, honestly, I had not looked at any of these things. And so one of the reasons that David Marwell said he selected me is because I had done a heck of a lot of interviews at the DEA, but had also no knowledge really of some of the nuances associated with the previous investigations. So he liked that and I think he referred to it as a fresh pair of eyes, looking at things, and so he's a PhD in history, and so he I think he appreciated the fact and when I came to the table, I didn't come saying, well, such and such said this, so I believe it. I didn't function that way. I said, I don't have a thought either way. And if you put me in the position where I was supposed to look at things, I'm going to do my very best to have an unbiased standpoint of looking at these things. And on top of that, I'm going to use due diligence to really dig into things and not dismiss them, which I think is a concern that some people had about who would be selected to serve in that role that I ended up taking, and I believe that that's a legitimate concern, with so many people, one side or the other. Here it is, just got this guy from Washington, D.C. that didn't have an opinion. And next thing you throw me in and give me all the access, and I'm told to go find all these people. I could tell you more about what my mandate was if you want, but to answer your question about what I was um, told, a lot of people, said, and my family members did tell me they saw Oswald. I'm sorry, Oswald shot by Jack Ruby on national TV, and what a shock that was. And so I did hear a lot of the things, but I think it's important for your listeners to know that my framework, my state of mind coming in to working at the Assassination Records Review Board, if I can just call it the review board, I've called it the Assassination Board. Some people makes them feel uncomfortable when I say that, but um, it was interesting, or the irony for me, I should say, is that I worked with so many people who just acknowledge, hey, I came into this, I was alive when the president was killed. This is my take on it, and this is why I'm here. So I didn't take away in a negative way if they already had a stance on it and working at the assassination board. I didn't take it that way. I took it as they were so intrigued by that part of history that they were excited to be part of an investigation to re-examine it again. So I can have a lot of respect for that. And I did have a lot of respect for that. And so you saw people like, a David Marwell and a Tom Samolak and a Jeremy Gunn and, a Tim Ray and a Doug Horn and, Joan Zimmerman and others that were so, passionate about what they were trying to do. And they would work tirelessly to try to do the best they could. All of our roles are very different. And so I guess the last part is what I think is should be connected to your question is, what did people ask me was this stance of this agency in looking at this, if there were so many thoughts about single bullet theory, conspiracy theory, the fact there's been so many reinvestigations of it, and for students, nowadays on campus here where I work, I try to compare it to 9/11 and say, just there's been one 9/11 commission. Imagine if there've been multiple 9/11 commissions. That's the kind of mindset, where the country was in terms of trying to address this. Um, so I do think that there's a lot to be said about what was the mandate of our agency, and why that mattered in terms of what we would have access to do, so that even if you had a stance already prior to starting doing that work, like, whether you were believing in single bullet or conspiracy, that as long as you're willing to be ethical and use due diligence, that it didn't matter. They were all on the same page. And there weren't many of us. There were less than 30 of us in the agency, at any given time. We had some kind of turnover and things like that. But I stayed there until I left to go do my PhD.
Well, when it comes to what you learned in the 2 years, I mean, did you start to notice certain things about the government that you might not have viewed before? I mean, necessarily doesn't need to be some grand conspiracy thing, but a lot of things very shocking to what is labeled national security. I mean, there's really nothing that should be national security. I think everybody on the ARRB agrees that I've talked to so far is the fact that 60 years later, there's still documents hidden. I mean, I want that term to be defined a little bit more when it comes to what these agencies are requiring as national security. Some stuff's like a paragraph document. I'm like, what the heck? All this talks about is that they went and had an off the dinner lunch or something like that. It's not even, how's that national security issues? And then this recent release as well, too. I think a lot of people were necessarily disappointed. I mean, you're gonna be disappointed probably every time if you're thinking there's a smoking gun or something, but there were some good revelations in there. Stuff about the HSCA I thought was prime important. Even a document I can't explain, and I would have to talk to you off air about it because that would really throw me in the conspiracy camp. Um, but there's just so much about there. Like, what is our agencies up to? I mean, let's start with the start of your work into the ARB, your interviews that you went on, whatever. I mean, I got one with Robert Mayhew that I had to ask about when you interviewed him or you talked to him. You sent a letter. It's in the Mary Farrell site. I'm just curious if you talked to him at all about his involvement in Cuba, what was going on more about the mafia involvement over there. I mean, that's a big, shocking revelation for a lot of people. And Mayhew gets called a cutout. I think that's what he was when it comes to connections or whatever with mob figures. I mean, Roselli, there had to be a go-between person. So I don't know, obviously you can call that a conspiracy, but what you learned from talking to the man, if he gave you any information, even if you don't accept his thing as evidence or anything like that, I just want to hear what the stories you heard, the interviews that you went on.
Sure, sure, and obviously, with the time, I could go on for a week at least,
Please
and just
do.
go through. Yeah, well, I can't. I still got other job stuff to do, but still, but going back to how you started that question, I think it's a great question, and so it's important for your listeners and viewers to know that, unlike the previous investigations looking at the president, his assassination, the assassination board was different. The mandate was different. It was created under the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992. Senator John Glenn, with his history, with NASA and everything, it's ironic that he put forth the legislation that became law, the act, it became the act. And the main quote, and I'm reading from, because I've got my actual copy here from it was sent to me, but that Jack Thunheim sent me, but when they in a letter to President Clinton, but that all records concerning the assassination of President John F. Kennedy should carry a presumption of immediate disclosure. And I think that kind of goes to what you were saying about, hey, we've had a bunch of different investigations. What the heck is going on? Why all the secrecy? And so it's interesting. I've been asked the question so many times, why are there still things that are classified? Why are there still, and how do and the other part of the question you didn't ask me is, how do I feel about the the fact that so many things, like, why did it take so long to get certain record groups released, things like that. I can't answer why it took so long to get some of our record groups at the assassination board released. Mine took almost 20 years to get released. I don't know why, but Um, I think that there is some validity in some in national security, in some things being kept classified for national security reasons only. And this is the same two guide points that we used when we were doing our work was to protect sources and methods. Like how do you gather the intelligence? We saw the information right now about the balloon, the Chinese balloon or balloons, and I've heard on the news that the FBI is excited that they might be able to gather information on the technology involved, and that's very valuable potentially, to know, how, uh, that kind of information is being gathered, in terms of what tools, what is it pulling, things like that. So the sources and methods, I think, is something that even if they're old sources and methods, if they're still valid or still used in some way, then certainly we don't want to give those out in public documents. The other thing is the information um, that's that's classified such a threat that it would be harmful to the United States in terms of our national security. So on that second point, I think that is the one. And this is going to part of your question about, why so much classified. I, I think that what I learned in my time doing this work was that it from the records that our agency released and working with other various agencies and so forth, you really get to learn kind of like the culture of the time period, and there are some folks that just it seemed like they just wanted to, and I'm not the only one that said this. I'm just kind of I'm in agreement. There's some people that and some agencies that just seem to want to classify everything, or folks within enough that it was an issue. They want to classify everything. Everything's national security, and you look back at it, it's like, well, why? Why? Not everything needs to be national security. So I think that that's kind of that second part about harmful and to national security that's that's not as clearly defined in terms of being able to to demonstrate or justify that as easily as sources and methods, which is very clear, which is one thing that when I was doing my work, I had to be trained on how to go and gather information pre-Google to be able to identify people. That was one of my primary tasks. Some people call it skip tracing, like identifying people that played some role in assassination lore, and be able to identify, the correct, Mark Johnson, which Mark G. Johnson, I made that name up, is the correct Mark G. Johnson associated with this particular event, where there might be 400 Mark G. Johnsons in the United States that are still alive in any one snapshot, right? And so, how do you identify that that's the correct one, or that same one is deceased, or that was a fictitious name, or things like that? So, I had to be trained on how to do a lot of that, and the way in which I was trained to do that, certainly, I don't think the general public needs to know that. And some of the tools that I use to be able to gather that and be able to pull it together. And sometimes you probably be surprised to know some of the ways in which was able to kind of really, dig and dig and dig and dig, which I think kind of helped me in my PhD program to really dig and find good resources to write my dissertation. But that level of due diligence to be able to find things, I don't think that should be just open to the public. And I certainly don't need to just give out people's social security numbers and home address and things like that. Um,
Well, the real fear is that the national security word that they're using is attempts to embarrass the agency. The agency has a really big job of respecting their credibility in the eyes of the American public, and if it makes the agency look bad, I mean, I think they've been put on blast in the past 60 years of constant investigations, picking and prying at different things that they did mess up. That's a dangerous thing to label that national security when we talk about. I mean, looking at the 22 release of documents and the 18 release of documents, they say Garrison's attempts to embarrass the agency. Does that look like a government that works for the people, or a government that looks at you like a bit of a problem? You know what I'm saying? Like there's really, really dark routes, especially when you look in the 60s and 70s, that don't reflect well in history when we look at the times of today, but you can't use today's time perspective for what they did back then. There's a giant fear of communism, a lot of things. I understand about that, but defining the terms, and I'm sure you came across it. I mean, like I said, the 60s and learning about the mafia connection when it comes to the CIA working with the mob to try and assassinate a foreign leader. The church committee exposed so much of that. And that stuff could be remained secret. I mean, the budget wasn't published in the church committee report because the CIA felt that it was a threat to national security for the public to know their budget. I'm not anti-government. I'm just saying that word is loosely thrown around. And
Oh, I agree. I agree. The word is loosely. I don't mean to cut you off, but I agree. The word is loosely thrown around, and like I was saying before, a lot of people that I worked with, and a lot of agencies that we visited. I'm talking about, government agents, federal, state, local. It was kind of like, you know, just exactly the way you said it. That the way the government functions at any particular point in time is based on kind of what are the norms of that time, and I think it became too easy to just put things in a cloud of national security. And so I think one of the good things that came out of the assassination board was that because our mandate gave us full declassification authority, I mean full, and the only way to appeal would be to go to the president of the United States, which was Bill Clinton at the time. That gave us a lot of different kind of power, if you will, or influence, whatever term you want to use, juice to be able to get things done that people weren't familiar with, and so much so this, mind you, this is before. I mean, I literally worked at the assassination board when technology was starting to transition into emails with attachments. I was busy before then at the beginning sending fax, having phone calls and sending faxes of our material, because a lot of agencies I would talk to, state, local, we were dealing with the garrison, records and so forth, and getting materials brought back from New Orleans and doing other things. A lot of places didn't believe me, and I would send them the material, and they look at the public law. Next thing you know, that's how things got done. But to go back to, I don't want to get off base here with your question. I want to stay on point. I do think that one thing I definitely learned is that far too many things were just put under this umbrella of quote unquote national security than that really should have. And I think the Albert Schweitzer College application for Lee Harvey Oswald is a good example of that. I mean, our, and mind you, David Montague, investigator, was not the person who was releasing the records. So I don't want your viewers to think that, start contacting me, asking me questions about that. We had a board at the helm of our agency, and they were made up of university professors, and at the head was a federal judge, Jack Thunheim. And so these folks would come to Washington D.C. Well, a couple of them were already in Washington, working, and they would review the records that either I would find or people on the other teams would find, and then they would make declassification decisions based on that. And so, to put it in perspective for your viewers,
well, don't worry about the
so
viewers. Just talk to me, man, because they've all caught up. I've had Tuna on the show. I've all had them on the show. So
okay.
yeah.
All right, so a lot of the work that I did, I worked in the investigation section, and when Ann Buttermer left, I became the senior investigator, right? And so I was doing, so a lot of my primary focus, and just, I'm sorry, structurally, keep in mind, um, we had a research and analysis area, and then we had investigations, and investigations reported directly to the executive director. All the other areas that are under research analysis reported directly to the executive director, Dave Marwell. But all the people under research analysis would be the CIA team, FBI team, Secret Service team. So a lot of the work that I would do on my own or in our investigative area, we would start up those projects, pick up projects, we would partner with the other folks to go and dig and find people associated with their projects and bring them together. So in some cases, there were things that I was already tracking down, like photo and film questions. A lot of times it might have been things dealing with, say, the Zapruder film, or what was going on with other, types of folks associated with, the FBI or the military, and they needed to track down people to interview. I was asked and given background information, and would do enough digging before I would go to do. And sometimes I had to go to other um, facilities outside of our agency to be able to do that work, to be able to find out and identify those specific people. Then I would use my interview background to be able to connect and identify that that's the right person, and then get them with. And so sometimes that would lead to depositions and so forth. So I think that's kind of like structurally that's important, because what it meant is that things that were going on over here didn't necessarily influence how we operated over here. And that's really important structurally for people to understand in terms of how the organization works. So, um, that mandate, in terms of what my primary duties were, one of them was to be able to identify people. Another one was to be able to find records. And I'm not a photo and film expert, but I have common sense. So if I go to Archives One or Archives Two, and I'm looking at an artifact and it says that it's a color film, and I have access to the original material, right? All of us do, but I have access. And so, and I go and I look and it's black and white, then that's a problem, right? That's a common sense problem, right? I was tasked to go look for the president's brain, and I went to Archives One, looked at the chain of custody there, and that, and I was forced to contact people in Department of Justice, I think. So you get the point that that's kind of a lot of what I did was finding people, connecting them, but I would stay on for the duration of some of the projects, but not all of them.
Once some of the projects you stayed on duration for, you just mentioned the president's brain. Do you know obviously we don't know where it is, but was that a Bobby Kennedy thing? Was he the one that requested his brother's brain? Because that Vince Bugliosi mentioned that in a court proceeding that happened, whether it was a debate or something like that. And that's still like that's the weirdest question that could solve so much stuff, but also the Harper fragment as well too. We don't even know where that went.
So the discussion of the brain is very interesting because I was part of a lot of people that were brought into Archives Two, and a lot of our work was done. That's what the JFK collection is, in Archives Two in College Park, Maryland. And so, a lot of us are brought, and in fact, it was early. It was in 1995. And I was new, and we actually brought in a few other people that were new hires at the time, and a bunch of us went over to Archives Two at the same time. And so the folks over at the National Archives pulled out a lot of material. We're in a big room, and a big kind of a U-shaped table around the room, and they pulled out a bunch of Hollinger boxes, and in those they had material from Lee Harvey Oswald. I had to go there many, many times with Ann Butterman to review all the Oswald material, everything Oswald. But for the brain, we had access to look at the autopsy photos and X-rays of the brain of record, and that's the way I always refer to the brain, as the brain of record. Um, and I did go, participate in a forensic science program at George Washington University, but I thought it was rather interesting some of the things that I was seeing, that there was a lack of scale in some of the photos that I was looking at from the autopsy, and some of the other HSC exhibits and things like that. And I held C 399 in my hand. I've seen the rifle and the president's clothing and Jackie Kennedy's clothing and all of that. We went through all of that stuff. And with the brain, though, it's so interesting. You see the different views of it, and you're looking at this brain, it looks like a whole brain. And I don't remember who it was. I remember somebody saying a joke, say, "Well, I wonder whose brain that is." And so I don't know. That's what I call it a brain of record, because if you've looked through some of some of the records that are out there, you'll see that we did talk to people from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, and we've talked to other folks who have talked about doing paraffin samples. And I'm not a medical doctor, I'm just a social science guy, and with some investigative background and common sense. And some of the folks that we talked to, these pathologists, were talking about paraffin samples and talking about what they did and sectionals and and then we've heard other stories about destruction of brain parts and things like that. And then I think back to looking at the what I saw, and I'd say, it just seemed to be strange to me. And I look at the chain of custody and the lack, and it ended actually in 1966. Which is the last year that there's a record of it being in Archives One. Um, and so, one of the reasons I did that was because I couldn't find anything in Archives Two, and they said, go get on the shuttle and go to Archives One. Now, Archives One is where the U.S. Constitution is, and I think not the Hope Diamond. Hope Diamond used to be there when I was a kid, I think, but that's where the Constitution is. And went down there, and I was kind of dismayed as to the lack of clarity as to where some of these things were. And I thought it was interesting that there were a lot of folks that were very excited about us having this access. And I'll tell you, Robbie, that one of the things that I really appreciated was the assistance from the research community. People that have looked at the assassination over decades, written books, and asked the questions, shown up at the hearings, and
Shout
things
out to
like
Jim
that.
Mars. I noticed he sent you a couple letters back and forth.
Yeah, yeah, and so yeah, and people that yeah, and I've met Jim. Yeah, I remember seeing Jim Mars a couple times over in Union Station over in Washington D.C. and see him in the bookstore and stuff back in the day, a long time ago. And so yeah, Jim Mars, and so and others. And so I really appreciate the research community because, and this is coming back full circle, if it wasn't for our mandate, and this is my opinion that I'm entitled to, if it wasn't for the mandate that we had that really did not put us against agencies, right? It really said, let's uncover everything we can uncover, put it at the National Archives, and let the American people decide, or whoever else outside of America decide for themselves, right? And it gave our agency the authority to define what was an assassination record, which had never been the case before. And I think that really shocked. And so some people might think, well, those other agencies aren't going to want to work with you at all. Well, my experience from the investigative standpoint is I had a lot of support, not only from the research community, but from our, other agencies, federal, state, local, international. People just seem to be very, very supportive, not in every case, but more often than not, didn't try to and I'm not like a naive guy. I think I'm pretty savvy. I mean, you can get some things past me, I guess, but I visited a lot of facilities. I can't name some of them now, for different reasons, but I visit a lot of National Archives and Records facilities, but I visit a lot of other types of facilities around the United States to do the work for the Assassination Board, um, and had to go look at some old photos and other documents and things of that nature in different parts of the country. And I overwhelmingly heard a lot of support, and we were able to negotiate getting a lot of documents pulled back in. But I want to and I'll be quiet to let you ask questions. I know we only have so much time, but I cannot thank enough. Looking in hindsight, it was so amazing to me to be part of an experience where we got so many people to work together. And mind you, I had to go into some agencies and look up people that were associated with those agencies while I was in those agencies. And so that's a precarious type of thing for this at that time 28-year-old, and I was 29, finally when I think I might have been 30 when I left. And so I was 28 when I joined the review board. And so but I do want to say this one last part for in terms of records and and connecting that back to the brain. With everything else that we looked at, I will tell you my intention for joining that agency because I recognize once I realized how unusual it was, and I still have a framed thing of my credentials and the authority agency up on my wall right next to my former DEA credentials and other credentials from other agencies I've worked with. here in my office at the university. And so I came into this really wanting to do my very best, and I did. I can honestly say I put in a lot of hours, just like my colleagues. I worked at a lot of different facilities. I mentioned all over the country, but especially all over the Washington D.C. area to dig. I had, I was fortunate to have a lot of computer knowledge and be able to multitask on that. Now you can do it in multiple windows, but back then I actually had like a chair on rollers and was rolling back and forth in a skiff in one facility, going between computer to computer to kind of cross check things. And I would stay there late on a Friday night doing stuff like that. And to do all the reason I say it is to do all of that. That's not because I'm not looking for any praise or anything. My intention was for the work that we were doing to be put in the National Archives and then released as soon as possible. And here it is 2023, and there are still questions about what's classified, what should be classified, what shouldn't be. That is not what I signed up for. And that's as plain as I can put it. That is not what I signed up for when I joined the assassination board. I wanted to see the same level of release that I put into getting things transferred to the National Archives. And I helped transfer, I had full negotiation authority to transfer records. I had authority to make the connections. I had authority to identify people. I had authority to speak on behalf of the agency, and authority to offer a deed of gift for transfer of records. And I met a lot of people. And I'm gonna say my record group, I don't think if it's at NAR reflects that. So I'll say it that. That's all I'll say on that.
It's a
But I
fair
wish, yeah, go ahead.
I will say it's a fair point because a lot of my friends that see my posts about the assassination or the records review board and they ask questions about it, they go, "It seems like the records review board was a failure." And I was like, "No, no, no. Neither was the HSCA either. You can't remember them like that and that's just because like, well, their goal wasn't met. It was like you guys really didn't. I mean, you guys might have had full access in a lot of aspects of things, but documents still being classified. The question comes up where it's like, wasn't this supposed to be out before? Why do people have to sue to get these records released? So I'm like, well, that's your agencies. That's not the people that are doing the investigative work, which puts pressure on what you guys had to do. And you guys had to go through a lot. It's just, I mean, and obviously it doesn't need to get conspiratorial, but from your personal opinion, nobody's going to accept it as evidence or anything like that. I'm just curious. I mean, like when it comes into the stuff that you were seeing, you're looking at the brain scans, things that common sense wise aren't really matching up. I mean, even the box with LHO, does any of that fit what the official story was? And I think even it's well documented now through even the HSCA's investigation is that there's a lot of things that the Warren Commission didn't get right. Whether it was a time thing, whether it had to be Oswald because of communism. I don't care. I'm never going to ask you about the who or any of the why part to it. I'm just saying from what you've seen evidence wise, what reflects in the archives and what the people in the research community have been able to expose stuff that has either fixed and new into the archives or given you guys guidance. You start to see that whatever that was created in the beginning necessarily isn't what we know now. And it's very important for the public's perception to understand the amount of work that people have gone into this thing, trying to show you, like, here's my job, here's what I did. None of that's going to be reflected because the history books are only still parroting the Warren Commission version. The HSCA should be talked about. You guys should be honored and talked about. I mean, that's a really important thing for my generation, younger generations, and I mean, people still care 60 years later. This isn't something that's going to go away. And the fact we're way past documentation should have been declassified already. But Jackie Kennedy's dress is 2183, I think is the date that that's supposed to come out. Why? I don't know why. Where's the president's brain? If you want to talk about like Bobby Kennedy taking the brain, which I've heard from the lone nutter side, I can't explain that, and I don't expect you to. But there's a lot of things with dates and times that make no sense way past a person's lifetime, unless someone in the government's a vampire and they're just living a really long time. It's a joke, of course, but there's a lot of things where history needs to kind of be rectified in a sense of letting the public have a little bit of closure, and that comes with declassified documents. There'll be people that'll stop researching into this. But there's also areas where, I mean, questions for you even as well too. What you found in the box of LHO. I mean, does he fit the lone nutter type that's always described as this quiet communist hanging out with Russians? I never even knew he got an interview at a mental hospital. I found that in one of your files on the Mary Farrell's site.
So, well, great questions. So, wow, there's a lot to unpack there. Uh, let me put it this way. I had a really I was in Florida a couple months ago, and I was on a another program with Jim DeGenio, and we were talking about the assassination, and we were actually talking about Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and all the other things were going on, and he's looked at Malcolm X assassination as
I
well.
just did a Fred Hampton podcast with two people that were on his met him when he was young. I don't know if you know who Fred Hampton is.
I know that name. Yeah, let's see.
He was assassinated, part of COINTEL program. He's part of the Black Panther
Ah,
Party.
okay, all right. Um, so, wait a minute.
Don't be reading off a script on me. Don't you do it. No, I'm kidding.
No. I'm trying to make sure I got the names right. So, I did to your point about the Lee Harvey Oswald material. Um, I've often described, and I've presented about my time at the Assassination Board many times, and I've described him as an enigma many times because there's the different theories, there's multiple Oswald theory and that type of thing, and there's different records of him in different places, same time, all that kind of stuff people know about already, and I don't want to rehash that, but that's um, but it's interesting that of the different types of things that we looked at the period looking at Oswald, and mind you, I've gone and looked at original, or at least purported to be original photos and films. I had to go into the vault at NARA, at the National Archives. I had to go in, put on the spacesuit to walk in. And I didn't believe it was that cold because my pen ran out. I stopped writing because it was frozen. It was because it's so cold. So I had to review so many different things over so long, and I hope you're going to ask me about Zapruder before we get off the
Yeah,
call
yeah.
too. But I do want to tell that story because I think it's really interesting. And I think that goes to the human element. But going through the Oswald material, I thought was really one of the most unique, other than the brain footage, especially, that became that looking at the autopsy photos, and I'll go back to LHO real quick, was the first when it first became real to me that, hey, I am part of something like, oh crap, this is real. I'm really part of this. I'm sitting in Washington, D.C. or Maryland at the time, College Park, Maryland, looking at being shown the official autopsy photos and x-rays of President John F. Kennedy. And then we also looked through some Martin Luther King materials. Martin Luther King is a Morehouse College graduate. I'm a Morehouse College graduate. Can you imagine what significance that is for me as a graduate of the same historically Black college that Martin Luther King went to? I mean, I'm a proud Morehouse. That's my Morehouse diploma right there on the bottom there. So, I mean, it became real for me at that point, that this is not a joke. This is very, very serious. So that level of intensity, when shortly after that, we were going through the Oswald material, that was different because the Oswald material, we had to spend a lot of time. I'm talking about a few days going through the voluminous amount of material that was on record because there have been many examinations of Oswald, questions about his capability as a marksman. We had to review boxes and boxes of spent shell casings, things, I mean, that are all there. We had to review material of Oswald that was taken off of him when he was arrested. They still have, and I mean, it was, talking about forensic samples of body parts, things of, exemplars is the correct terminology to use, hair and other types of things. And so, that's surreal, to go through and to look at that. And I was a young, like I said, I was new at the agency at that time, I was 28, and you can imagine how, I mean, X-Files was like one of the top TV shows of the time, is my recollection. I felt like my life was the X-Files at that time, going to work every day. And so going through the Oswald material and looking through all of that, and in looking through his records, I did go to the Federal Records Center many, many times, in St. Louis. Um, and it's interesting, and I interviewed a lot of people that knew Oswald. Um, have and I did go down to what's now the sixth floor museum. I had to review a lot of records. I had to look at so many different video and film from different angles. Um, uh, Later on, I've done, like, most recently, I've actually done a, a discussion along with Ernst Titovets, Paul Gregory, others, from Dallas. And I walked into this whole, I'll
Yeah,
call it, thing with no preconceived notion. And when I left to in 1997 in August to go to Washington D.C., I mean to go to Howard University, still in Washington D.C., and start my PhD program in political science, um, I left with the full belief that there was no way in hell that Oswald was this lone gunman person. And I had met um, you know, the others associated with the HSCA, um, you know, Robert Groden
yeah.
and others. I knew Bob Groden, I've seen him, and I remember his time at the HSCA, in terms of his discussion of his time at the HSCA. I've heard the audio material that he introduced during the HSCA that really put on record that there was an additional theory, a conspiracy theory put on record. The HSCA didn't say it is, that it supports it, but it didn't say this is. But it's the only other time that I know of where you had a conspiracy theory put on record uh, to be out there, thanks to Robert Groden's work. Um, so I walked away not. I just don't see that, and I'm convinced of that to this day. I just don't see that being the case. I see so many other unanswered questions about Dealey Plaza, about the characters, and that's the term I'll use, associated with all areas within Dealey Plaza, including behind the fence. I've been down there so many times. I've interviewed so many of the people down there. I've interviewed a whole lot of people. I mean, a whole lot of people, and then sitting through the deposition material and then looking through the Zapruder material as well, and knowing what it would take to really pull that off, one person. I just don't see that being the case. And again, I'm just a social science guy that I think has common sense, but I did have access to the actual content.
Now, when it comes to some of his effects, like, can you tell me some of the things? Like, did they have anything that came on him? Like, what was on him that day that they arrested him with? Like, did he have a half a ticket stub in his pocket? Did they have revolver bullets allegedly that they found on him? I'm just curious what he had that you were able to see of his, besides, like personal photographs, hair samples, and things of that sort. But any like items that you would consider strange or just different that don't have an explanation to it?
Well, offhand, I'm glad you asked that question, and I don't want to say something that might not be true. I'm trying to recall if I remember something like that. I do remember the kind of forensic samples that they had from him when he was in custody, but um, and I remember going through. I mean, it's not to what you're saying, but I remember looking at the flashcards where he was teaching himself Cyrillic. You know,
So he was well educated.
he was not a dumb guy. I mean, he's actually, and if you knew, and like I said, I've had conversations with Ernst Titovets, who was his best friend, Oswald's best friend in Belarus, talking about him navigating the language over there and having to kind of, how do you handle yourself, with being one of the few English speakers, at that time over there. the part of the whole question about how he got back into the United States and Marina as well, and the baby. So, all those different stories just seemed, and that's not answering your question. But again, it goes back to, I just don't see. It seems like it's not him by himself.
Yeah,
I don't have recollection of other items off the top of my head that I would be confident enough to speak to, from when we did the material that were on him when he was, uh, arrested.
that's fine. Because I
I
want to
did
get
want to
to the
mention Zapruder before we get off, though.
we're going to. I want to get to the Zapruder thing. I got to ask about the mental hospital. Is that real that he got a job at the mental hospital or tried to get a job at a mental hospital?
I can't talk about that. I can't bring that. Yeah.
Because to me, they allegedly he tried to commit suicide up in Russia, and he had marks. When you interview people who knew him, I mean, were they his brother, like friends? Were there anything? I know Jim Mars sent you a little
Friends.
paper, uh,
Right. Right.
but when it
But
comes,
friends. Yeah.
okay,
Friends.
who friends wise? Can you say names or?
It was mainly, I would say, Ernst, and in the Dallas area, Paul Gregory knew, also in the Dallas area. But you're talking about in Russia, in spending time in the Soviet Union, I should say. Um, that was an interesting time with him. And we say, well, is he well educated? I don't think that he was this slouch of a guy that some people try to portray him, as. I mean, do I think that it was weird that he had, an association with, what's the guy's name that we found? Give me one second. Uh, the Morn Shield. I do find that that was a little unusual. Again, that goes to my point of, Lee Harvey Oswald is not just some lone person just doing this on his own.
If you can answer the question of how he got a venereal disease in the line of duty, I'll give you whatever you want. That's a great. Blakey couldn't even answer that one.
I won't be able to answer that one for you either.
That's a mystery question, man. I'm telling you, that's
Yeah.
$1 million. I'll kill. I'll die wanting that question answered. All right. Before we get to the Zapruder film thing, I gotta ask: did you get to speak to Robert Mayhew? We kind of skipped over it a little bit, but Robert Mayhew, did he tell you anything interesting about like mafia and the CIA or anything like that that you can speak about?
On organized crime, let me start by saying that, um, it isn't. A lot of people don't realize that at that time it was not commonly accepted that there was a thing as organized crime, officially, even though there was. So, and so, we did, look at a lot of material dealing with, networks, families. Um, I'm not sure what's been released on that part, and so I don't want to, go any deeper into that. But I do know that, uh, between some of our teams, that we're doing on the research and analysis side, we did look at, several things related to organized crime. I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of different people associated with that.
Now, let's get to the Zapruder film that you wanted to mention before, obviously, we go. But I also got to ask about Gail Nix. I saw that you tried to deal with her film as well, too, which is just that's baffling to me in its
Yeah,
own. The Zapruder
yeah.
film, I thought was the only film. And then someone just goes, no, there's various films. I'm like, what? And I start realizing, of course, the president's coming to town. Everyone's that has a camera is going to have their film out, whether they're good films or not. I think the Zapruder is probably the best, but it's just interesting to see different angles of that day. I mean, I also like listening to the audio tapes too of like President Kennedy arguing with a general about chairs, and you hear him say the F word. I was like, oh, that's John F. Kennedy.
So the next film. So,
You can say Nix or Zapruder. We can go to whichever one you want.
I could do the next film. Uh, well, a lot of people, that are not familiar with the Knicks film, and I was not. And it's so weird when you talk about photo and film authentication, because I remember, at one of our public hearings, uh, I think it was a Baki came and asked me at one of those. I think it was James. I can't remember the first name off the top of my head, but nice guy though. It was very excited about about our wanting to be very open and working with the research community, and you know, talking about the importance of photos and films and asking, well, David Montague, since you're supposed to be doing, what's your background in photos and films? I said, I've taken some, I just have, and I felt, I wasn't embarrassed. It was just the truth. I wasn't a photo film expert, but I was a guy that was willing to dig. And then once, you identify some things, then the appropriate thing is bring in people that have the real knowledge base. So for a lot of people there that don't know, the next film is considered very important. Excuse me. It was taken by Orville Nix, and it's considered by many to be just as important as the Zapruder film. Most people are familiar with the Zapruder film. They saw it in JFK the movie and things like that. Which actually in JFK the movie is what prompted the creation of the Assassination Board, by the way. So the law itself, the bill was passed into law by John Glenn.
Still
But
haven't seen it. Still haven't
oh
seen that
well,
movie.
yeah. So what's it, so the next film is really interesting is in the sense of the stories associated with it. So I think what's important for people is to think about the photos and films in terms of the stories behind them. So with the photos, a clear example of importance of them is the number of, for example, the number of people that said they took photos and gave them to people identifying themselves as government officials in 1963, only to never see those mentioned in the Warren report, and it's saying that they never saw those things in there, and how do I know that? Is because I interviewed a lot of people that brought that to my attention, and then they knew enough about things that I could say, well, wait a minute, this person actually does know something here. So I think it's the stories associated with, the context for all the photos and films that really become very important, in addition to what they might visibly show. I hope that makes sense. Um, so the Nix film, and what's common, I think, with terms of some of the films, Nix and Zapruder, is that there's still some discussion and about what happened with the Nix film. What's its connection with UPI, which is United Press International, the copyright? Has do we still have did we ever see a true version of it? I believe that Nix was actually interviewed by Mark Lane, uh, uh, back in the 60s, I believe, like shortly after the assassination, a few years after the assassination, to talk about that, and possibly having a copy, of the film. So um, I think that the stories associated with that are just as important. And what I think I want to end with the Nix, and I'm going to get over to Zapruder real quick. I got 7 minutes before I have to get off. Is that there's still so much controversy regarding this, and I know currently, I know I've and it's no secret, I've been contacted by folks asking about the Nix film and my knowledge of it, and asked me some questions of my recollection of my time there. Gail Nix, the granddaughter, I believe, of Orville, trying to push for return, and yeah, and so I think that that's important. So again, it's the stories behind what's going on with that I think are so important. So with Zapruder, and I don't know if you uh, 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 but let me jump over to Zapruder. Okay. And so with the Zapruder film, and this is kind of what I was trying to get at with when I first joined the review board and was asked about photos and films. I kind of had to fit that in with my workload. You know what I mean? I didn't really have anyone saying, "Hey, I need you to do this on this date. I need X number of films." It was we were checking out so many leads. People were bringing things to us from the research community. Government agencies were, providing documents or letting us know about, records that they had. Like Georgetown, I negotiated the transfer of I think 400 brownouts, of 400, it might have been 4,000 brownouts from Georgetown University over to Archives 2. That's a public record. And then of course things that family members and others, wanted to donate to. So I was always doing that, but I had to fit in going over and looking at photos and films and checking stories out, things like that. And so there wasn't really a real schedule. So I remember a lot of times I would just, pick a day, go over, pick a film, pick something to look at, write some notes, pass that information on. Um, and when suddenly one day I said to myself, wait a minute, I, I've been here like a year and I haven't looked at the Zapruder film yet. It was just like happenstance. Like hadn't, I just was in the office one day. It was probably like around 1 or 2 in the afternoon. Yeah, it was like 1 or 2. And I called up the fourth floor, where the media section was, audio visual, section at the National Archives too, and said and talked. I forgot who it was, but I talked to them and said, "Hey, I just thought about what are y'all doing this afternoon? I'd like to come by and look at the Zapruder film." They were like, "Okay, just we'll get it out for you. Just we'll tell you where to go. I'm just, you know where to go when you come in." Because they'd have a different room to view things in than you come to for the main area, for to protect the integrity of the materials. That
They
makes
catch
sense.
fire.
Yeah, oh, yeah, yeah, the fire, yeah, yeah. I immediately just walked down the hallway and started telling. I mentioned to uh, David Marwell, said, David, and I want to say it was a Friday, and I was like, hey, I'm gonna go down and check out this Pruder film, and I'm probably just gonna go home after that. And I remember the look on his face, like in his chair, like what? So apparently he had never seen it. And then he went, did you tell Tom? And did you tell Doug? And and I was like, no, I just was gonna go look at it. So I said, he said, can I come with you? I said, yeah, come on, let's go. I was out to come back to the office. So he was like, give me a minute. So I went down and told Tom. Tom was like, get jumping out of the seat, and I'll tell you, I have a lot of respect for Tom Samolak. We usually worked really well together. Some things we butt ahead on a couple of things, very rarely, but I really have a lot of admiration for him in terms of his due diligence to really, you know, give his all to the time we had our mandate to do that work. And then I went to Doug Horn's office, and then I said, Doug, I'm going to see this Zapruder film. Apparently, a lot of people want to come with me. He was like, "You're gonna go see the Zapruder film?" I was like, "Yeah, come on, let's go." So a bunch of us hop in my little Jeep Wrangler, and I remember riding over to Archives 2 to go look at the Zapruder film, and us going in, and they had it sprawled out on a table, and there was the lighting underneath the table, very soft white light. And and here it is, these folks who have been focused on this topic since they were little, all of a sudden it was like they were in a candy store. For me, I mean, I kind of got excited too once I saw their excitement. But don't get me wrong, at first I was just like, oh, I forgot to go look at the Zapruder film. So let's just go do it. It's just like another, day.
That's gotta be
And it turned out
crazy
to
to
be,
see all those names just jumping around, basically chomping at the bit. Like, oh my God, you're gonna go see the Zapruder film?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so we, I remember we spent a long time that day and was so much discussion. And then, I left the agency before all was said and done, but that's how we kind of, got the ball started rolling. I wasn't there toward the end, but really the film authentication, which became a national big deal for what do we value the Zapruder film at? Whose property is it really, and blah blah blah, and that kind of thing, and Kodak involved, all that kind of stuff. It really was just a bunch of us just like in a room, just like hey, but it was, I never forget everybody looking to see. I want to see the spot. I want to see where it's burned. I want to see, and just to see that level of focus on it, and was just one of those rare moments in my life that I will never um I will never forget. You know, um, so I think that's what I really wanted to say about the Zapruder film, because I think that um, there's so many other films and photos out there, but I think that's what I want to end with. I think I was trying to think of the nurse I saw in Los Angeles, um, Phyllis Hall. And if I've still got, I could do like another minute or so if you don't mind, real quick. So one of the things that really surprised me though was, with all the access that we had here, to my dismay, in 2013, and I was still a faculty member over in criminal justice here at my university at that time. I hadn't moved into administration yet. And so I get a email from this guy's professor out at Los Angeles City College, which is in Los Angeles, and they were doing like a 2 or 2.5 week project to really try to just engender the notion of caring about history with undergraduate students at this community college, which I thought was fabulous. So it didn't matter whether they were fans of assassination law already. It was just knowing how to focus on a topic, dig, understand theories, debate, that kind of thing. And so he asked me to come out. He said he got some grant money. He was going to fly. It was the 50th anniversary. So I said, okay. So I get there, and he said, you're going to be one of our keynote speakers. I said, oh, who else did you bring? And he says, we've got Phyllis Hall. And I'm like, well, who is that? And he said, Phyllis Hall, and I was like, I don't know who that is. I've talked to so many people. Who is Phyllis Hall? And so I met Phyllis Hall, and I had no idea that she was at Parkland and was not on the roster, and was there when they brought the president in to Trauma Room 1 at Parkland on the day of the assassination. And the reason she wasn't there, she was fill-in nurse, and was not on the roster because everybody had gone down to Love Field to see the presidential motorcade, right? So she's telling her story, and when she's telling her story to these folks who are hearing it for the first time, I'm hearing it for the first time. So after all this time of me interviewing so many people and them crying and telling me about their how glad they were to be able to share their story, and how hurt they were that their records had not been released yet and material had not been released yet, their stories. Here I am, like, for me, that was a kid in the candy store moment, because this person is telling level of detail and then filling in other notion of, hey, a nurse came in and grabbed another shell casing and took it upstairs, and we never saw it again. And then said that her colleagues who were on the roster started saying that they were being followed and were threatened, and many of them quit their jobs. And so she's been interviewed many, many times, but I thought to myself, what is the irony that I could have had that level of close access, and here was this person who was right there at ground zero, the same day as the Keystone Cop, the ARRB released those records, about what happened with the casket, you know, going up to DC, and she was right there and saw the president being worked on from a medical perspective. Really? So for me, that immediately took me back to when I had to track down to do the autopsy doctor, depositions. I was, tracking them down, things like that. And so that came full circle for me. So I just want to end with that, because I think even someone like me who was right there and had full access, you never know what surprise is out there in the store for you. So I will stop at this point.
No, that was perfect, man. I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. Do you have any links you'd like to promote, and possibly the book that you might be coming out soon?
I don't have any information on that book yet. I can give you let me give you my website.
And I'll be able to link it all in the description as well too.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, man. Your
And
history. Your history. It's real living history.
on there I talk about the, that yeah, I do plan on doing that JFK book. I appreciate your time, and please share the podcast once it's out to people, and thank you for what you're doing and talking to people. I think it is really important. Um, I when I went to, I'll say this, and I do have to get off. When I went to the Citizens Against Political Assassination conference, I went. There's a high school physically on our college campus, and I went over to that high school, and I wanted to do the same thing that professor did in Los Angeles. I said, I want to give an opportunity for younger students to get an appreciation for, our history and how it can relate to connect to job opportunities and things like that in terms of building skill sets. And I got 81 students, high school students, and 2 college students actually, to sign up to participate in the student conference for the Citizens Against Political Assassination conference last November. And I tasked them to start looking at questions associated with assassination lore. And in fact, I can give you those too if you want. Let me pull it up real quick, and then I'll make
Yeah.
see. I'll give you the answers too.
You're not even gonna make me work for it?
Oh, okay, I can do that. You
I'm
want?
just kidding. No,
Okay.
send the answers. I don't think I'll be smart enough to be able to handle that one. I'm not a very good researcher. I'm just a general public interested in a very important historical event.
That's what that is. And then here's the link to it. It should open up for you.
And I'll link those in the description too, in case anybody wants to check it out.
Oh, you know what? It's restricted. Hold on a second. Let me recopy it. Okay.
But did you want to sign off and we can get you?
All right. There we go. Okay. So should I close and say thank you, or
No,
what am I
I
doing?
got this. Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blanket. David, thanks again for talking on my show. I really appreciate it. And stay tuned for our next episode.